All right, thank you, sir. Can everybody hear me pretty good? Okay, well, thank you for coming to the panel today. So my name is Scott Anderson. I've had the pleasure of being the Army Cyber School and Branch Historian since February of 2017. Today I'm excited to moderate this panel. We're going to look back at the first 10 years of the Army Cyber Corps and the Cyber School. For the sake of time, because we do have quite a few panelists over there, I'm not going to read their full bios. You can, of course, look up their biographical information in the program, but I will give a few points about each person. Okay, so first off, and they're not going to be in order, however, Brigadier General Kraft is the first one at the table. Brigadier General Paul Kraft, he most recently served as the Deputy Commanding General of Joint Force Headquarters Cyber with U.S. Army Cyber Command. In this role, he led a team of over 150 soldiers, civilians, and contractors providing cyberspace support for U.S. CENTCOM. Before then, he served as the Chief of Cyber and Commandant of the U.S. Army Cyber and Electromagnetic Warfare School. Tomorrow, I'm pretty sure this is the case, sir, tomorrow he will retire after 31 years of service. Okay. So next up, we have Colonel Leslie Gorman, who is the Army Capability Manager for Electromagnetic Warfare at Fort Eisenhower, Georgia. She has served in various intelligence, cyber, and EW roles throughout her career. She most recently served as the R-Cyber Director of Current Operations before becoming the ACM EW. Next on our list, we have Chief Warrant Officer 5, Richard Godfrey. He currently
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The session is beginning to start.
Okay. He currently serves as the Senior Warrant Officer Advisor within the U.S. Army Cyber Capability Development and Integration Directorate. His most recent assignment was at U.S. Army Central as the Senior EW Technician. Next, we have Chief Warrant Officer 3, Tiffany Northern. She has served in many different MI and cyber roles throughout her career. In 2019...
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Jennifer Swanson, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Data, Engineering, and Software.
Okay. In 2019, she volunteered for an assignment at the U.S. Army Cyber and EW School, where she served as the Joint Curriculum Technical Advisor. CW3...
All right, good afternoon, everybody.
Okay.
So, yeah, excited to be here.
I think we got some technical difficulties here.
Up? I think we're working on getting charts up. Okay. So, I'm going to be leading a great panel today. We're talking really about the importance of MOSA and digital engineering.
Is there any signal officers in the room?
If we could go to the next
I can't help you.
So, MOSA, you guys actually saw this chart this morning. This is the same chart that Mr. Bang talked about.
I saw the representative go out the room, but we'll see if he's able to
what we're doing
figure
and
this
how
out.
we're thinking about it. So we've talked a lot about open architectures, and really I think there's two main benefits to open architectures. One is for the government, and the other one's for industry. So for the government, we need the ability to be able to plug and play solutions. We have not been good at that, right? So we end up kind of getting vendor locked with a vendor, and that really doesn't benefit our customer, who is the soldier. So at the end of the day, what we want to be able to do, what we have to be able to do, is pivot, bring in new solutions available from anybody that are going to make the product better for the soldier. And the only way we can really do that is...
Does my microphone still work over...
So for us...
Test, 1, 2,
really
test. Oh, yeah.
The importance of MOSA.
It's still
For
coming out of here,
industry, it's competition, right? Because when we're vendor locked, that doesn't help you guys
If I
either,
unplug it,
because
then
that means
I'll
you
just
really
have to
don't
talk pretty
have
loud,
a bite
right?
at the apple, because it becomes very difficult for the government to move off of whatever that vendor is, and so nobody else can really play in that space, and that's not beneficial to industry either. So to me, I think MOSA is
Okay,
a
so I
win
assume this
for
doesn't
both
work
of
now,
us.
correct? Okay.
MOSA,
Test, 1, 2, test,
to me,
test,
is a very
test.
loaded term because it means different things to different people,
All right,
depending
so,
on what your
where
requirement
was
is.
I
And I
here?
think that's really what you're going to
Okay.
hear from us
CW3
today up in
Northern,
the
she
panel
now serves
is We have MOSA for data. That data layer is critical, and that data layer is how we're going to be able to interoperate, really, across all of our systems. And for us, the UDRA is that MOSA for data. It's going to level the playing field. It's going to have everybody producing data products that are conformant with the UDRA so that they can easily be exchanged. And if you think about, if you kind of take it a few steps forward, it really is going to allow us to evolve quickly from this point-to-point architecture that we have. If you look at how we communicate with our systems today, it's all point-to-point connections. It's messaging standards that are very antiquated. I'm not saying we don't need messaging standards in the future. I think we will in some cases, but that shouldn't be like the default means of communication. So UDRA as MOSA for data means we're all creating data products, and I should be able to just go get the data product that I need to be able to get the information that I need. And that's kind of what MOSAizes it, if you will. From a software perspective, it's really API.
So this slide right here, I'm not going to leave it up for very long, but
couple.
basically,
Hydra is
when
one
we're talking
that
about the last
IWNS
10
has
years of the
developed,
Army,
and you're going
Cyber
to hear
School,
about
Cyber
it from
Corps,
Christine Moulton a little bit later on the panel.
one of the things that I always remind
but
my
generally
students
speaking,
of when
open
I'm giving
APIs.
them
We don't
cyber
want
branch
APIs
history brief
that are tightly
is
coupled
that,
to a
yes,
platform.
we are
That's not
celebrating
open.
10
So if I need this platform to use the
But that doesn't mean
API,
that the
that
Army
kind of defeats the
itself
purpose.
has
But
only been doing
what we do
cyber.
want are open APIs that we're able to use and
Test.
plug and play different
Are we
things
good to go?
at different times. The other piece of MOSA for software is the
Test.
modern software framework that we're developing. We've released parts of it. Basically, it's really a methodology
Well, I'm just
of
gonna
how do you
continue talking
create
because we're kind of on a tight
reference
timeline
architectures
on
and
the
reference
slides.
implementations for your
so
product.
basically, I just like to remind
What are
my
the
students
things that we need to
Cyber School,
provide as
yes,
standards
we're 10
out to
years old,
industry
but
to be
Army
able
has
to
been doing
develop
cyber
into?
for quite some time, and some
And
of
then
the
what are the
milestones
things
that I have up
that
on the
you
slide
guys
here
own
reflect that,
we don't
okay?
need to worry about? And really
So,
what we're trying to get after
in
is
around-
is going to invest in capabilities. We're not saying we want all of the IP, right? We're okay with black boxes to an extent.
Test.
We want to be able to replace those black boxes as better black boxes are available, but we understand
All right,
that
so
you
I'm
guys
gonna keep
are investing
talking.
your money, and we're not after that. And so
In 2000,
I think
this
this
on the slide here.
the
2004,
concept
the
of
National Military
reference
Strategy
architectures,
declares
reference
cyberspace a
implementations
domain
coupled
to
with
man,
APIs
train,
is
and
what
equip.
helps us to get to that
Signal
point.
and MI had been doing
And then, of course,
cyber
we have most of
types
hardware.
of activities
So,
for quite some time.
you know,
It's
we're
around
going to hear more about
2013 and
CMFF
eventually
today on the
officially
panel.
2014
Lots of
that the
different
Army
MOSA for
creates
hardware
this brand new
standards
cyber
that are
core,
available.
cyber
Again,
school.
depending
So
on what is
my
need.
first
What
question
do
is
I
for-
actually need to do?
Test. My first
So
question
I
is
think
for
when you take
Brigadier
all of
General
those three
Kraft.
things together, the Army
Essentially,
is very much trying to go after
why did the Army
open architectures
decide to create a
for all of
focused
the things,
workforce?
digital, hardware, everything.
For cyber.
Next chart. Okay, so digital engineering real quick. So I'm just
Test
going to do
1,
like a
2? No.
stage setter here.
Just a
and
loud
then
voice.
call the
Okay,
panel up and you can hear about what the
I think what
PMOs are doing.
we really determined,
So
and the Chief of Staff of the
we worked
Army,
on this digital
and Sergeant
engineering
Potter reminded me of
directive
this,
vendor
said,
for
hey,
about
we really
6
need
or 7
a
months ahead of
cradle to
our
grave
We signed it in
career
May
path
of
to
2024.
deal with what we're talking about
And
here.
really what it does is
Best
set
way
the
I can
stage
describe
for
it
the
as a,
Army
I'll
to
say, as a
establish foundation
20,
for
25-year
real
signal
digital
core
engineering
officer, straight
adoption
25
across.
alpha, is
we are
what the signal
in
core
charge
was
of
set to do
executing it
was
on
to
behalf of the Emperor, and
engineer,
we've put together,
secure, operate,
an
and
IPC
defend
from really across
networks.
the Army. We've got
And
ASC,
our,
we've
you
got
know, our
ASC,
intelligence
we've
core
got
is what
ACAD,
provide,
we've
and the
got
MI is what
ASC,
provides the
we have
critical
IBM, we have a few other
intelligence
big
elements
players,
to,
coordinator,
in order to make
everybody's
operational
really
decisions.
bringing
So as
digital
Intel drives
to the task
operations.
so we can leverage
What we didn't have
what has already
is
been
what we're
done
looking for
across the
was
Army,
a
and then
maneuver
we're
force.
assigning
And that
OPRs
maneuver
to
force,
programs, and
a
that's
force
how
that
we're
is
approaching
therefore not static,
output.
comes in and leaves on the battlefield, can
So
move
let's
from
talk about the
place to
tenets
place
that
in
really
order to
there's
be,
4 tenets
and there's really
of
2
this
purposes
directive.
of
And I will say
maneuver.
the under was
One
very, very
is to move to a
involved
place
in
to ensure
development. It's not
success
trust me,
because
we
you
did
found
not
something that's
do that
critical
in front of
to your
the
network, like a gateway
He
or a
was very
router
involved in the
or a
content
specific
and
mission
making
command
changes.
system. So
He
we
wanted
would
to
place
make sure that
maneuver
it really
forces
reflected
there that
his
are
intent
highly
and
trained,
everything. So
or to prevent
the first
failure,
one
to
is
stand in the gap,
establishing these digital engineering
to stand in the
focus
gap
areas.
on what we
So
need to do
we
to
have-
protect critical
we picked
assets.
3.
And then on the attack
ground,
is we want to
aviation,
prevent
and
the
sensors.
enemy from
And the
maneuvering
concept
onto
is really
our
these focus
space.
areas
And there just
are
wasn't that skill set that existed within our military. Certainly the Signal Corps handled what I will call the static defense. Blocking positions is probably a good term to use. We would probably say in the Signal Corps, firewalls, routers, switches, segmented networks. That's how the topology of our networks are built, and that's the expertise of what the Signal Corps provides. That's what 25s and the functional areas that support that provide. But what we didn't have was that maneuver force that was highly trained, that did have access. One of the secret sauces within the 17 branch is the access to TSSCI in critical intel, primarily signals intelligence, SIGINT, that we get from MI. And what MI had done for years, primarily the SIGINTers within that space, is they had really filled that gap. Not their job to do maneuver because they're to provide intelligence for operations, but they were certainly within that space. That's why, the big why, that's why the Army, that's why the Chief of Staff and then the Secretary of Defense said, we need that specialty maneuver force that understands first the network, can see the network and understand it. Right now we're talking about tactical network or strategic network, think physical. We're not even talking about electronic warfare yet. In order to see it, sense it, and to be able to properly defend it, and then also to see and sense the adversary's network to properly attack it and stop their ability to maneuver within our space. That's why it was created. That's why we had to set up a specialty school, a specialty branch of officers and warrant officers and soldiers in order to do that. So that's a quick why the 17s exist and how they're differentiated from 25s and Signal Corps and 35s military intelligence.
Okay,
You know, SysML
sir.
2.0
These
is
next few
really the
slides, they don't
path
specifically have
for
questions, but I'm going to quickly just walk through a quick chronology here.
the devil's
So
always in
typically
the
we look
details
back
when
to
you're
around
implementing
February
standard.
2013
And so
when
I think it's really important
TRADOC
that
Commander
we have all
Cohn
the
kind of
vendors
gave a
aligned
public
in
call.
terms of
He wasn't the first person to
implementation
say
of
this,
that
but he
standard
was one of the
so that
primary people
we
who
are
started
able
calling for
to
this. Now
share
it's
data
General Raymond
across,
Odierno who
because
really
what's
gets
happening
behind this
today
idea. And so we do start to see things quickly moving, okay? By 2013, our cyber had already announced that they were going to move their headquarters to Fort Gordon, Georgia. 2014, the Army comes out with this executive order that says, okay, Fort Gordon, you're going to have this new cyber branch headquartered there. You're going to have this new cyber school headquartered there. You're also going to have, you're going to switch names, okay? You're going to be no longer be called the Signal Center of Excellence, but now you're going to be called the Cyber Center of Excellence. And so now both of these new schools would operate under this CCOE, okay? It was also decided back then, at that point, that electronic warfare would move over to this new cyber branch, okay? And so August 4th of 2014, Colonel Jennifer Buckner, she becomes the very first commandant of the cyber school and the chief of the branch, okay? But our big birthday that we're about to celebrate here coming up in a few weeks is the birth of the cyber branch, okay? So that's 1 September of 2014. When the routing slip is going around the Pentagon, General Odierno wrote on it, he said, important and historic. So that's one of the major milestone here, okay? So very quickly, there would be a subject matter expert panel that would be organized. And the first one to focus on cyber would quickly go up to Fort Meade, and they had about 3 weeks to form a plan. And so we have a couple members of that SME panel that were part of that SME panel. So CSM Potter and Chief Northern, who at the time, if I'm not mistaken, was Sergeant Northern. She was the most junior person chosen for this SME panel. They participated in this. And so I would like to ask both of you just what were some of the primary issues and questions that the SME panel worked on?
We have some software ones, and the idea of that was really
Hey, yes, thank you for your question. So from my perspective, yes, that was the most junior and that was a little difficult. But what we took away is that we acknowledged that we had a critical role to fill. We had to not only identify how we would be able to recruit, retain, and I guess distinguish between, the cyber branch, identifying those highly skilled individuals and ensuring that we were developing a pathway for them to grow, not only, on the enlisted side, but also from the officer and the warrant officer side. So how do we take the mission at hand and ensure that we are not only creating a branch that is kind of differentiates between the MI and the Signal Corps, right? But also, how do we provide a structure that allows these individuals to, professionally grow and be awarded the opportunities to continue to develop not only their skill set, but
and then the
their
last
professionalism?
one is
And I'll hand
really,
it over to
I
you,
will
Sarah
say,
Major.
best for last.
So one of the big things that we went up there, and I've actually mentioned this a couple of times, most recently at the Quad C, when we asked about how did we get the cyber branch. And so what we started with is we started with the framework of 3 buckets. We looked at the 2 populations. We were only scoped to be able to address the JFHQC and the CPB and the 780th at that time, and the work roles associated with it. And we drew out 3 buckets across the piece. We said, this is cyber maneuver, this is support to cyber, and then in the 3rd bucket on the far right, we had specialty support to cyber. And we looked at each one of the work roles at the time. There were more at that time than there are today, and looked at the analysis of putting those work roles as we have into the actual buckets of what they ended up. And so in the far left bucket on the chart ended up being host analyst, network analyst, exploitation analyst, and ION. And that was what we decided was going to be the core cyber maneuver work roles. And then going from there, we then articulated these are the jobs that would then convert to being a 17. And then went through the actual force structure of identifying these individuals are 17s now, these individuals are 35 Quebecs, which were the ones that remained as the outlier, specifically as that specialty support to cyber, or this support to cyber column in the middle. And then the developers or capability engineers was put into that far right bucket that we would address later at a future point, which we did roughly about another 5 years later.
I'm going to
Okay,
invite
thank
my
you.
panel
Appreciate
up,
that.
if you guys would
Okay, as we
join me
move
up
on
here
here,
the
in
stage.
around 2014, General
And we'll
Odierno
kick off
had
the panel.
directed our cyber to look at the feasibility of integrating cyberspace operations into conventional maneuver. And so the result of this was a pilot that they called, here we go, we have an acronym within an acronym, right? So Cyber and Electromagnetic Activities, CEMA, Support to Core and Below, so CSCB. And so CSM Harshman, you participated in this pilot, and so just kind of wanted to get your viewpoint of what lessons were learned.
Thank you. Okay. All right, well, welcome, panel. So,
Test. Okay.
we
So
can start
when
down
when
there
we first started
down this way.
CSCB,
If-
we actually didn't know what we were asking for.
Introduce
We didn't know, the
yourselves
brigades
and
didn't know what they were
just
asking
talk a
for.
little
We
bit
didn't know what
about
we needed
why
from
you're
them.
on
It was confusion on both sides. So what we did is we stacked the team with as many professionals as we possibly can, with all diverse backgrounds. When we went to the brigades for the very first times, talking 25th ID, 2 ID, 4 ID, when we went to those brigades, the biggest problems that we had was that doctrine did not support us.
Matt's on this panel
We were not
that
indoctrinated.
cybersecurity
They didn't
is
understand
legal
us. They didn't understand our
engineering is
capabilities.
critical,
When we
and
told
it's a
them we
big
can
gap, I
do
would say.
something,
And
for
so
them it
Matt's
was
doing
it
a
was
lot of
gibberish. It
work
didn't
to
make
talk
sense.
about
Like, how can you do this? It
in
took a
terms
long
of
time
how do we
for
secure
us
data?
to
How do
get
we
them
make
to
sure
understand that
that,
we're another
you know,
tool in their
Houston and
toolkit.
Kingdom aren't gonna get hit by
What we
China,
did is
and they're
when
gonna
we
have all
merged
this
with
time.
EW at the brigade level in the division, it was opening doors for us. So when we made that change, if you will, cooperating, partnering with EW, very soon after that, the CEMA cells came aboard. And then when that occurred, then everything else started falling into place. Now we've got doctrine, we've got lessons learned from all these rotations we did. Change was really happening. But I think that the paramount lesson learned that we had from there is that the brigades wanted to do their best, but they didn't know how to utilize us. So that education and forming was just a constant thing. And it's a constant thing still today.
Okay, thank you.
Develop communication
So as we
system.
think about the beginning of this new cyber school that was just starting out, of course I have that icon up there. A lot of times we talk about the plane being built during flight and that kind of thing. But so we have some members here of the panel that were some of the earliest members of the cyber school. And so I wanted to ask Chief Godfrey and CSM Potter, just how did this small team, it was very small at the beginning, how did it accomplish everything it was set out to do? Because General Odierno gave a very quick timeline for this, which, I always remind my students, we always talk about how the Army and the government doesn't work very fast, right? But in this case, we had to work very fast.
For PEO, IWNS Integration Director.
All right, so I'll start with this one. So very simply, it was a power of wills. So as we started, we identified that just like any type of thing, when the chief of staff makes a decision, because it was briefed to the chief of staff first, and he looked around the table to all the ACOM commanders and asked, is there any disagreement with this course of action? Nobody disagreed. It was approved. So the weirdest part of doing this entire process is it was already approved by the chief of staff of the Army, our plan. And so the difficulty we had was how do we navigate through the cogs of the wheel of TRADOC to eventually get the paperwork all the way up to the chief of staff of the Army's office so he could formally sign a document that he had already given verbal approval of during the briefing at the conclusion of the SME panel. And so I remember very vividly, then Colonel Buckner, later General Buckner, pulled us, me and at the time Major Hack Wynn, pulled us into our office and said, we have a problem at TRADOC. Go, don't come back until it's done. Okay, ma'am, no, go TDY and don't come back until it's done. And that's exactly what me and Major Wynn did. We went all the way to TRADOC. And what we actually figured out was the cog in the wheel was an individual there kept on, I don't care about what the CSA said. I don't, and he kept on saying it a couple of times. And it finally, when he finally said the rest of his sentence and we realized what the cog was, I don't care what the CSA of Fort Gordon has to say. Oh, wait a second. Wrong chief of staff. It's the chief of staff of the Army, one each General Odinero, has already gotten the approval of this. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, yes. Yes. And then very quickly the cogs unglued and the packet went up to the Department of the Army within a week.
So I'm glad Sergeant Major Potter went first because I wanted to hear his take on it. So I got to the cyber school actually before Colonel Buckner showed up, and it was just a hodgepodge. It was like we were grabbing bodies anywhere we could find a body, and so more of an on the ground experience is that if you've worked in a COE and you're dealing with .mil PFP, and you know who does what, how it's done, who do you go to get the right paperwork or the right forms or anything like that.
Going back to what I talked
none of
about
us
earlier,
in the school had done that before.
and
And so we would sit around and try and figure out how to, write a lesson plan, how to manage a course, how to, who to write doctrine, how to do all those things. And internal, and then we would go over to because remember, it just became the cyber COE. It was the signal COE. And so finally, we would go and talk to somebody in one of the signal offices, and they're like, oh, well, you got to go do this. And you're like, I just spent a month trying to figure this out, and here are the answers and not knowing who to talk to. So that was kind of, it's really amazing in my opinion that it actually got done as fast as it did, because I think there was 12 of us, and that including the support, the S4 and S1 staff that we had at the time. There was a total of 12 of us trying to put this together, and I remember, personally, I had 3 titles at one time, and they would change. Like every 2 weeks, I would get a new title and lose a title and get a new title and lose a title. So, it was very frustrating, and I still don't understand how we managed to come together and push all that through. It just had to have been, force of will, force of personalities, like Sergeant Major Potter going up to TRADOC to let them know, who the Chief of Staff of the Army actually is, right? So, yeah.
Showed us.
All right, thank you. Great insight.
Which was very impressive.
So as we kind of keep up with our chronology here,
are moving very quickly.
it's between March and May of 2015 that the Cyber School Proponent Office has to do all the necessary changes to create this brand new MOS, so the 17 series. And one of the things I always like to remind people is the Army chose the number 17 to show that cyber was a maneuver branch, a maneuver force, because it kept along the line of the teens numbers. So we finally get the creation of the 17 Alpha, the 170 Alpha, and the 17 Charlie. The effective date of these were 1 October of 2015. However, before that time, people had been able to apply for the voluntary program, and so they were starting to be notified of their acceptance. And I have an example here from an email that somebody sent me where it says, Dear Cyber applicant, congratulations, your branch transfer request to Cyber has been approved. And so that's just an example of what was happening around this time. And so it's around August of 15 when the very first class shows up to the cyber school. Okay, so about a year to the date when that ribbon was cut, the very first class started, and that was a BOLIC class. They also were the very first class to graduate in May of 16. Then also we had the first Warrant Officer Advanced course, and we had another big milestone was when the first 17 Charlie AIT class graduated in August of 2017. Okay, so now a little bit about, as we talk about this transition to cyber, from the EW transition. Officially on paper, it took place on 1 October 2018. The couple of years leading up to that point, it was already essentially, the cyber school was already training the EW soldiers. We had already had the EW college out at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. But then officially, we had a ceremony on 1 October of 2018 when General Hersey was the commandant. And so I just wanted to ask Colonel Gorman and then Chief Godfrey, why did the Army move EW to cyber, and what has changed since that decision?
That's an interesting question. So, just going to harken back to when I actually executed electronic warfare operations. Back then, I was a SIGINTer, and it was actually during Iraq, conflict in Iraq. As a platoon leader, it was literally you were a SIGINT/EW officer, and it wasn't even a baseball hat switch, right? And so back then we called it tactical SIGINT. From my take, and then the chief has lived this longer than I have,
the digital engineering, I would say
the ability to apply non-lethal effects in a kinetic fight is important. And the Intel SIGINT folks, there's a very unique requirement for that data to get to the force, so that way those effects can be implemented. And I think that was something that I would think probably predicated and set the conditions for where we went forward with the electronic warfare and how that aligns with cyber. And it's a natural fit, right? It is RF. You have aspects of electronic attack that ties along with offensive cyberspace ops. You also have your electromagnetic force protection measures, and then also the electromagnetic support aspects of being able to understand the environment, sense it, and be able to make decisions out of that.
Concerns or possible issues with our interoperability and the data exchanges.
So I'm beginning to not like this panel because it reminds me of how old I am. So I came into EW, I think, in 2009, right? And so really the reason for EW was the prevalence of radio-controlled IEDs, right? And so we had to defeat these. SIGINT did EA, but they didn't do it on the roads as you're going down, MSR Tampa. So there was this really large need of this capability very specific to IEDs, and at the same time, you need more soldiers to operate it, right? And so if you're familiar with the SIGINT community, it's not a very large community. And so they stood up, they started out with 1 Kilo, then 1 Juliet, and then created the MOSs, right? So you start out with 29 Echoes, 290 Alphas, and then the FA-29s, managed by HRC, the Fires HRC, and then out of CAC as the proponent office. So you really have this kind of hodgepodge. And at the same time, the three legs of EW, ES, well, that's very, very close to SIGINT, right? EA is a form of Fires. EP, a lot of the things that we do in EP is very closely related to Signal. And so I think what the Army said is, hey, if I give it to one of these three, it's really that, if you've got a hammer, every problem's a nail, right? So if we go to Fires, we're just going to shoot all day and we're not going to care about anything else, right? And so when Cyber was standing up as a branch and they're looking at it and say, hey, there's a lot of commonalities, however, they don't have their own little, rice bowl that they're going to protect to do what they want to do with it. So that's why I think they went with the cyber route, but it was a very interesting timeline especially for EW, because we were, like I said, we were kind of all over the map with where we were. We didn't really have a somebody to feed us, and then all of a sudden, hey, you're part of cyber, and we're like, I don't know anything about cyber, but okay, let's do it. And that's where we've been since, and it's worked out pretty well.
All right. So, Bill,
Okay,
over
thank
to
you.
So, I spent
So,
some time at
of course, we
PhD
got to talk a little bit about COVID
and,
because it was such a
it's funny
huge,
is that
multi-year
honestly,
event,
a lot of
right? And
things
how it
changed,
changed
but a
and
lot of
affected the
things stayed
cyber
the same.
school and the whole
And I
Army
think
at
the
large here.
network is,
But
was, and
so around the
always
spring
will
of
be
2020, of course, when everything was starting to
because
shut
a lot
down,
of it is bought
cyber
commercially.
school course managers and cadre
making all of those
we were
things
very
work
well
together and
positioned at the
interoperate
cyber
is
school
challenging.
to rapidly
It's never
transition to
really
online
enough,
training.
right? We are
All
not
the
gonna
courses
have enough
apart from
bandwidth in a
AIT
technical environment
did
ever,
move to
and that's
distance
somewhat
learning for the most part, with
physics
very
and
little
other
stoppage in
things,
training.
but, it's
Most of the
just always a
graduations were
challenge.
canceled, which was
How
unfortunate.
is C3T
But
using
General
digital
Craft, so
engineering
you led the
capabilities
cyber
to try to
school
do
during
modeling
this
and try to
time.
get
And so
after some
can you
of
give
that?
us some insights as to how we
Yeah,
pushed through
so,
this?
what you're saying is.
Yeah, it was definitely the toughest times for us, but we were, because of how unique our training is, and a lot of it is delivered via the computer. We were the first Army school of all the Army branches to turn and go to online training, full time. From your house, from the barracks. So the soldiers didn't even have to leave their barracks room to have the training, and the officers, warrant officers, didn't have to leave their house in order to stay in the training. And an amazing team there at the cyber school did it and lifted and shifted over a weekend. So, I mean, the students were super excited because they were thinking they're going to get about 2 to 4 weeks off of training, and the Army would keep rolling along, and that would just be training lost, and you'd probably still get a certificate that said you graduated, even though you may have missed months and months of training, which many Army schools did because the Army keeps rolling along. But our cyber school, being a little bit unique in our ability to train online, we were able to lift and shift that, and believe it or not, even the privates all come in with really high-speed laptops. We were able to get the barracks properly watched, because we realized we overwhelmed the barracks internet services, as we all try to turn on every barracks with services in order to get that done. So we had some slow starts on the soldier side, but the officers and warrant officers immediately to jump right in and get after it. And most of our curriculum, I would say, is at the we do teach in skips for I'll say context and content. But in terms of what we teach about how we do maneuver in and through networks, it can be taught at an unclassified level. We're just not able to explain the whats and the whys and the hows and the whos and give all the cool scenarios of why we, come to this point in the network and turn left and why we would go straight. We can't explain the why or how, and we can't give any of that historic context. And so there was, I'll say, something that was lost, but we were actually able to get people into a skiff for maybe a week at a time in order to do that. And we really created a bubble around our school and campus, and even between the barracks and the mess hall was really just a very safe place for everybody, and we really didn't have the COVID issue. I think we had more instructors, downtown that were getting COVID than we had any students, and we had thousands of students, on our campus at the time, doing work. So again, it was really hats off to the training center. I see Dr. Smith in the back, and so just ask him, hey, I need to make this happen, see you Monday. And his team was able to do some Herculean work in order to do that, and the Army was very impressed, and we didn't really skip a beat in that process. So just, hats off the team and online training that we're able to do.
That across all of our environments.
Yes, thank you, sir. I'm definitely thankful that now when I get in front of the students in the classroom, I don't have to wear a mask anymore, and don't have to be pulling it back up every 5 seconds as I talk. That's been a huge relief. Okay, as we move on here, just kind of keeping up with our chronology, another major milestone within the cyber core is the most recent MOS that was stood up and activated. And so typically we call these the tool developers. The official name is the Cyber Capabilities Development Officer for the officers and the warrant officers, the Cyber Capabilities Developer Technicians. This officially was in place, activated on 1 October of 2021. However, before that, there had already been several pilot courses which had started. And you can see there, I like to point out when I brief the slide, especially when we look at the warrant officer basic course. Just take a look at the number of weeks at that course. From what I understand, it's, if not the longest WOBIC course in the Army, maybe the aviators I've heard maybe a little bit longer for various reasons, but it is a very, very intensive, long course for those warrant officers that are going to become tool developers. So here on this slide, I have a couple examples that are mainly revolving around the Ranger community. We had in 2018, Staff Sergeant Kelly. She became the first enlisted female to successfully complete Ranger School. In 2021, we had a couple members of the Cyber Corps 17 Charlies that graduated from RASP to become members of the 75th Ranger Regiment. And so I'd like to ask Command Sergeant Major Harshman and Chief Northern, just kind of from your perspective over the last 10 years or so, what is the evolution in opportunities that members of the Cyber Corps have and how that's changed?
These RFIs that you guys give us that feedback, because it's definitely going to affect you. But at the end of the day, you got to be able to secure the.
So I would say in the beginning, we really just focused on those work roles that were aligned to the Cyber Mission Force, and I think that allowing people the opportunity to now expand out into other organizations was extremely beneficial. One, because those personnel who just get tired of doing, the team level work, there are personnel that want to expand out. They want to get into that tactical, those tactical organizations. They want to be able to continue to expand cyber out into, a greater, warfighter construct, right? And so allowing personnel to go into not only, the Ranger School, but also within MDTS or creating 11 Cyber, creating these organizations outside of the traditional Cyber Mission Force allows personnel to use those highly skilled, cyber skills that they do have, not only to just support cybercom initiatives, but also to branch out and expand out into, some of the CENTCOM AORs, the UCOM commanders, and then, getting those specialized trainings, because not everyone wants to just be on keyboard. They want to understand how they can utilize, their cyber skills to expand out into the warfighting realm.
What the standards actually allow us to do is talk to you.
Yeah, I don't know how I do better than that. I'm just going to be honest. So I would say from this perspective of the enlisted members, right? So the enlisted members have always wanted to do something else. They've always wanted to do something different. What we gave them was opportunity to do different. For the longest time, for the last 10 years, we have tried to figure out how do we keep our cyber force, how do we build our cyber force, how do we keep them in, how can we compete against the civilian industry. I mean, how do we do that? And one of the things is, and one of the opportunities that the Army gave us was to expand their horizons. So for those that did not want to stay in Fortitude Hall behind a computer every day, we gave them opportunities to do other things. And then on the flip side, by giving those opportunities to them, we are actually educating and informing the force at a greater level. So it's helping us both on both sides. So soldiers are getting what they want. They get that job satisfaction, and they can jump out of airplanes if they really want to, and they can scale walls if they really want to. So those options are available now. But what it does though is it builds the force, and it lets also the Army know that we are soldiers. We're very smart, we are highly technical, but we are soldiers, and we want to help this nation win. That's what we want. So.
Could I add just onto that? So, what Sergeant Major was talking about in Chief Northern, when this branch kind of started, the mantra was, hey, it's going to be cool because you're pretty much going to be in Maryland or Georgia, and you're going to sit in a very carpeted area, and you're going to be doing remote operations, and you'll have a choice of Maryland or Georgia or Maryland, and that was maybe Texas or Hawaii, but primarily Maryland or Georgia for the entire career. And people were like, cool. But there were plenty of soldiers like, but I just went through training and, what about the 82nd, the 101st, the Rangers, Special Forces? Can't I do that? And I will tell you, that's what a lot of soldiers get excited about, is being airborne Rangers and being in those type units, being at the edge where they are. And I will tell you, there's plenty of times, even today, and it goes on all the time, where we know we can't do it remotely. What we need to do remotely to do our job in the maneuver space, that we just can't maneuver to that faraway place somewhere in the world, that we're going to have to do a thing called close access or proximal access, where we got to put a team on the target as coffee breath close, or maybe Wi-Fi close, close, in order to get what we need to do. And those are some exciting things, and those are some special additional, I'll just say, Army skills that our soldiers get to do. And it's really the Cyber Warfare Battalion is really the one that's set up to be able to do that, for us today.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thanks. Yeah, I remember the...
Okay, as we move on, just want to highlight something here. Electronic attack simulation at the school. So as the school's evolved, we've obtained different authorities over the years, different authorizations to include EA, or electromagnetic attack. And so this past spring was kind of a pretty big milestone for the 17 Echo AIT soldiers. Their field training exercise included a simulated electronic attack during their FTX. Chief Godfrey, I know this is kind of a blind side because I didn't tell you this beforehand, but just wanted to see if you had maybe just a couple thoughts on the significance of the cyber school now being able to do this electronic attack during their FTXs.
So I think probably the biggest significance is that we actually have a piece of equipment that does electronic attack. That's pretty huge. But being able to do it here, at Fort Eisenhower, you got to understand everything that goes into place, right? So you got to get authorities, permissions, FCC, FAA, to turn these systems on. And Fort Eisenhower isn't exactly an isolated installation, right? You have an airport, you have Augusta, you have all the populace, you have first responders, you have all these other frequencies running around you that you've got to coordinate with and deconflict from. And so being able to do that in a training environment and letting those soldiers experience what that's like, and if anybody's been through basic training, when you're doing that low crawl with the M60s or now the probably 240s, shooting above your head, right? They're not going to hit you, but that realism that it adds to your training, it lets you understand how important this is, how important your job is. So when you go out to that force and that you're susceptible to electronic attack, right? It's not just you. Now it's a unit. Now you know that this could cause lives. This is a critical piece of modern warfare that we see, every day in other theaters. And so to be able to experience that here in a training environment live is just enormous.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for taking that question without having knowledge of it ahead of time. I appreciate that.
It really is, I think
so just this slide here, just real quickly, shows some of the growth that we've had over the last 10 years or so, showing the size of the force. And some of these statistics may be a little bit outdated now. I think they're pretty close to accurate. The total Army cyber force right now, all three compos, over 5,000. Pretty cool statistic. From FY17 to 21, the student population grew by 500%. Okay, so we started training officers in 2015, warrant officers in 2016, and then by FY17, we were training all three cohorts. Move on, just a discussion a little bit here about the reserves and National Guard. We know that the Army, the active duty cyber force, is never going to fight by itself. And so my question is for CSM Potter and Colonel Gorman. Just how has the Guard and reserves, and cyber, how have they kind of evolved over the last decade?
I'll go ahead and lead up on this one, and then Sergeant Potter will finish up with the strong ending. So I have to say that our cyber Compo 2 and Compo 3 truly inculcate citizen soldier, and they have really stepped up to the cyber fight. Specifically, I'm going to just touch on, I'm going to open up a Compo 2, our National Guard brothers and sisters. They essentially have that operated our Title X remote operations
There's
infrastructure
probably
under Task Force
initiatives that,
ECHO
like Christine, you
for the
might
better
be
part
able
of
to
8
talk more about
years.
specifics with
So
joint community
a lot
and
of
other
counter VEO
community
efforts
partners. I think
were
looking at it
were
certainly from a
managed
service
and executed.
perspective,
And we wouldn't have
but
been able to do that
also
without their
if there's
support of
anything you
operating and
can add
maintaining
to from a
that
joint
infrastructure.
perspective.
Also, currently,
A lot of the work we're doing,
under the Technical
with
Warfare
our
Center,
standards
we do
APIs,
have some National Guard
applies
support that
to
have been doing a
joint
year-long analytics effort. Tiffany
from a
was talking to me
macro
about this
level,
before
similar
and how it's
concepts
evolved
what we're trying to
into
do.
some persona
We're
management
actually
efforts in
working very
support of
closely with
IA
the Navy,
operations and
the Marine
current
Corps.
real-world
We're also working
efforts.
with
So that's a
a lot of our
huge
intel
deal.
partners to
And then
come
on
together and
on the
commonize.
defense side,
What you'll
our
see
National
is
Guard
as the
network
Army, is
hunters,
executing
if you
more of
will,
these joint
have been a
experimentation
huge
events,
support in Cyber Protection Brigade
there's going to be
and
much more
conducting
emphasis on actually
very
using our
niche
standards to
hunt
share the
efforts
information
on
and data,
OT systems
starting
and
to
networks,
test
which
out
are
and
have a lot of
show
emphasis right
the
now,
interoperability
especially in
between
our
our joint
cyber
systems,
and how we
at
work through
those
those tasks,
meetings and
those
exercises.
critical
So, I
those
think
critical
as we move forward,
assets.
there-
And then
there's
on
gonna
our
be
reserve side,
a lot
I have
more
the Combo 3.
demonstration of capability
Specifically,
where
we had
our Army sensors,
we also have a
our
cyber protection
Navy
team
sensors, and then
that
Air
currently
Force,
operates and
also
focus a year-long
our
effort
intel
on
friends,
cloud.
all
So
sharing
what this really
information
means to us
common-
is this is a chance to
APIs
not
and formats.
only
A lot of the work that we're doing with the joint
it helps us
community
to retain
is
talent,
looking
so we are
at
able to
the
take
standards
our
they're
active duty
using,
cyber
standards
cyber
we're
soldiers
using,
that
and
maybe choose to go,
aligning
hey, I
the
want to do a different
architecture.
path.
So at the fundamental engineering
Gives them a
level,
chance
we're
to continue to
aligning the
serve our
architecture so
country
that we
as a
have
cyber
a seamless
cyber
switch
professional.
between
But it also
common,
helps,
standards
so retains the
and
talent.
interfaces. So as far as
That
our
I would
operators
also
and our
submit that it
soldiers are
helps us
concerned,
upskill our
the
active duty
information is
workforce,
flowing, but behind
especially
the
on
scenes,
some of
we're
our,
doing the work of
probably our
aligning
more
the
complex and
architecture.
sometimes
I think
emerging
that
technologies
as we move
to
forward
ensure that
with
they
our
maintain
interoperability
and
into
sharpen
digital
their
engineering,
skills. Because a
we're
lot
gonna
of
start
our
commonizing
Combo 2
on
Combo 3
common
soldiers
architectures,
do
common
work
reference
in
implementations
industry and
we
bring
are
those
going to
skills
align
to
together
the
as far
cyber
as
fight. I don't know,
government
Sorry, Major, what you think?
goes as far as the
So what I'll add to that is what some people fail to realize with our Compo 2 and Compo 3 force. So besides Task Force ECHO, that is a mobilization. That is no different than a deployment. And sometimes people forgot that as they looked at our Compo 2 and Compo 3. Yes, it was a stateside deployment, but it was for a year. And it was done at the periodicity of those National Guard battalions as they stood up. So every 4 years, those individuals were being mobilized for a year. So if you think about it for our civilians in the room and your profession and what you do, that every 4 years, some of them are on their second rotation, looking at planning already for a third rotation. And then we moved into our Army Reserve. And so what we look to the future of our employment of Compo 2 and Compo 3 is how do we as Army Cyber leverage the technical abilities of our Compo 2 and Compo 3 at the periodicity of their routine training, battle assembly, and pieces at their home station. Because it's a whole lot easier to deploy a guardsman or an Army reservist at their actual drill location in their battle assembly 1 weekend a month or 2 weeks during the year, having them on mission to augment the Cyber Protection Brigade specifically, but not having the associated mobilization costs that cost the Department of Defense, let alone the cost on the individual of having to deploy away from their family and their job routinely every 4 years. So more to follow as we figure out how to better employ our Compo 2 and Compo 3.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right, this brings us to our last question. Looks like we've got about 10 minutes before this is supposed to end, and I would like to have some time for questions, but I would like to ask each one of you, as we go down the table, starting with General Kraft, just kind of thinking about, you know, here we are, we're celebrating 10 years, and so what will the next 10 years bring for the Army Cyber Corps?
And will CSPs assist
That's
with
okay,
the
Tubbs' question.
infrastructure
I've always said this as we've grown up, and I guess was able to take the branch from being a 5-year-old to being a 7-year-old. That's a pretty good analogy. We're about to celebrate our 10th birthday, and so we're as good as any 10-year-old in terms of what we need to do. So in 10 more years, you know, we'll be in college. You know, we'll be, you know, at 18, we'll be the smartest person on earth. You know, just like any 18-year-old. We know we have so much more to grow and do We know that we still have to continue to build out our force. We know that we always need to continually improve on the education and training and readiness of the forces that we do have, ensure that we get from a maturity model, we have, basic trained, advanced trained, and then master trained people. We need to get to the point where we have enough, I'll say, people trained at the right qualification level. And the reality too is the oldest person in our branch is a captain that's now looking at major. That's the highest rank we have of anyone that's a natural born 17 is a captain in the United States Army. Legit. That's where we are. And so I know that there's so much more maturity that's out there, and everybody that's older than 10 years in this branch here in this, on this table came from some other branch, either most likely the Signal Corps, the MI Corps, or from Functional Area 29 from the electronic warfare side of things. And so we know that we're all adopted into this space. We know we have more growth to do, getting us from being a 10-year-old to being a mighty 20-year-old that's out there. That's all. Thanks.
So really quickly, when we started this, we said that we would build it, and then we would assess it, and then we would build again. And here we are 10 years, we're at that tipping point now where we have to go back and reassess the cyber force as a whole as our mission has evolved. And we've tried to figure out how, and not only has our mission evolved, our mission has expanded. And so how do we address so we don't go down some of the pitfalls of some of our other branches where we have a strategic force and we have a tactical force, but we actually have, as our mission was in the beginning, a cradle-to-grave career field that an individual can move in and through both the strategic force and the tactical force and be able to generate effects as required at the time and place of choosing.
I think, so there's been a couple of efforts. Last year, our cyber did a data pilot on understanding, mapping out data of all the DODIN data. And this year, we're currently there, the Technical Warfare Center is also doing a data pilot for RF data. And I see that those two efforts really growing legs because I think we're going to see a lot more growth in developer work. I think our 17 Deltas, I anticipate to see them branching out into other areas. How we're able to leverage content to not only deliver effects, but also to get to the point where maybe we're able to introduce some predictive analysis. And that's going to help really how we shape the cyber fight. On the electronic warfare front, I do see on the same end is being able to harness that information and get it to the maneuvers in order to be able to provide those the shaping support, the shaping effects for a force that is transforming content against a very credible pacing adversary.
Your chassis, your competitor's chassis, a bucket full of cards from all.
So for me, I think it's really the formalization and how we're going from here. So, when I came in, my school, my 290 Alpha school was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Right, and it was completely on slides, just PowerPoints, death by PowerPoints. And when we stood up the cyber school, we made a deliberate decision at the time to really focus on cyber because they didn't have a curriculum, they didn't have classroom space, they didn't have all those things that we had at Fort Sill. And so we kind of put UW and said, hey, we're gonna kind of place you guys on the back burner a little bit, and then when we get to a point where cyber's up and running strong, then we're going to come back and re-engage. And so, and we've seen that re-engagement probably over the past 5 years or so, but now we're really getting to the point where the curriculum for EW is really starting to take off, and it's really starting to modernize, and we're starting to learn to use the lessons learned from combat operations that are ongoing. And as you can see from the last question he asked me is, we have live training now. We're shooting those cyber or those EW, electrons out. And so over the next 10 years, how does that develop there's very close relationships with the capability development community, where we are now bringing on equipment online where the soldiers are going to have the kit to go out and train with on their back that they're going to use when they get to their unit, right? So I think that's really the exciting part about EW right now is those next 10 years where we go from still trying to create what our base is to, hey, this is how we're going to fight in the future, and this is what we're going to fight with.
Showing the soldiers very shortly that it works in their kit.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so in the next 10 years, I think that we will continue to identify and recognize more opportunities to recruit and retain this talent, this talent pool. I think we will also learn to develop training programs that will allow for ensuring that we are providing our soldiers with the most up-to-date technology as the technology continues to rapidly change. And I think what we'll see is a morph of how we ensure that we are preparing the cyber force, not only for the cybercom efforts, but as well as the tactical level efforts out in meeting the COCOM's intents as well.
Focus areas. I'm very interested in learning how you did it.
So in my opinion, I think that capabilities are coming. They're being developed every single day. I think that what we're going to see is a blend of capability and capacity being brought to the brigades, to the divisions, to the corps. I think that's going to drive a lot of doctrine changes, but I think most importantly, though, there's going to be a very large development of concepts of employment and concepts of operations. And then when we get to that success and we have that, the doctrine is marrying up with the capabilities will keep driving forward, then I think it's going to be a true success for the cyber branch to support that type of effort. And it's coming. It will come.
So I think
okay, thank you so much, everybody. I think we may have time for just a couple of questions potentially. We're getting close. So any questions for the panel?
Beyond just the engineers, right? Because when this directive that the undersigned is Army-wide, it's not just for the engineering community.
Anybody?
We really, ideally, ultimately,
I guess you guys have answered pretty much everything they wanted to hear. Okay, here we go.
But in order to do that, we need to be able to get contracting folks and lawyers and budget people and logistics people and other folks to be able to really process those digital procedurals. And so how are you doing that within industry? Because I would imagine it's a similar kind of effort there, that you don't want to have to convert all of those things to paper and hand them to the budget people so that they can figure out what they need to do. I think getting an understanding of how you're doing that would be super helpful. Anyone else?
Yeah, and that's what we're looking at, right? The path forward. We're not going to get there tomorrow, so we're going to have to lean heavily on industry building us those models. But we're taking a look right now, who needs to be trained with what curriculum, right? And I totally concur with what you're saying. We have been so focused on the engineers, but now we're looking at with the configuration managers and enabling business processes with those, the logisticians. But how are we going to build that path that we have that hybrid? Right now we're heavily leveraging on industry, but eventually we're going to get to that organic type of workforce.
Yep. Yeah, and being able to scale that training. Obviously, not everybody needs the same thing, right? So what does that look like in your organization? So, all right, well, thank you very much to my panelists. You guys did a great job, and I think hopefully everybody got a good appreciation for how we are approaching DE and MOSA in the ASOL community. Thanks a lot for joining me up here.
Thank you for joining us today. The next session in this room is a keynote presentation from Lieutenant General.
Let me just go through. Here's a challenge that I think the Signal Corps and the MI Corps either have solved or are still challenged with, and it's the challenge that we're now dealing with as a 10-year-old branch. I'll give
Thanks
it to
again
you.
to the audience. We'll see you back here shortly.
Sergeant Major Potter talked about the strategic and the tactical force. The challenge that we're having, that we know we need to solve, and we're looking at our brothers and sisters in MI and Signal, is if you have soldiers, warrants, officers who grew up in the strategic force for 10 years and then are told they've got to go to the tactical force. So think they grew up in NETCOM and now they're being told to go to Forces Command, or they grew up in the 82nd and now they're being told to go to NETCOM, or they grew up in 501st MI and now they've got to go to a division, they're INSCOM to Forces Command. There is definitely a reticence of going from the carpeted, parking lot area, type of brigade to going to NTC or GRTC rotations as like, this is your life for the next 3 years. And so I am telling you, that is something that we as a young branch are looking at, the definitely older branches, as something that we know we need to solve to show the permeability of the skill sets that we have that can be used both at the strategic all the way down to the tactical edge. And it's great value. It's great value if you have that officer, warrant officer, or NCO that knows how to go from, satellite to dirt and back, because then they understand the entire enterprise that we're dealing with. I'm just telling you, that's a challenge. If I want to throw out a challenge for you all to answer or solve for us, the challenge is creating that new branch that has good permeability between being strategic all the way to tactical and back. That's something that we know we need to work through, because it's back to recruiting and retention and challenges that we face, today. So I just threw one out there for you as something I know we need to work on. So, Scott, I'm sorry, take over.
No,
back in charge.
I think that's a perfect way to end the panel. I know we're out of time, so just thanks everybody for coming. Thank you so much, panelists, for agreeing to do this.